Cold open. November 1950. Somewhere in the mountains of North Korea, the temperature has fallen to 30 degrees below zero. Steel cracks like glass. Rifle bolts freeze shut. Blood turns to ice before it can even stain the snow. Men who have survived the fury of the Pacific War, who have survived Normandy, who have survived Okinawa, will later say that nothing prepared them for this. They are United States Marines. United States Army soldiers. British commandos. South Korean troops. Fewer than 15,000 of them, dug into the frozen hills around a reservoir most Americans back home have never heard of, and never will pronounce correctly, Chosin. Surrounding them, in the dark, in the silence, in the folds of the mountains, are 120,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. An army the United States government insisted again and again was not there. It is there. And in 17 days, it will try to erase an entire United Nations force from the face of the earth. What happens next will become one of the most brutal fighting retreats in the history of warfare. It will be called a defeat by some, a miracle by others, and by the men who lived through it, simply, the Chosin. And those who walked out of those mountains alive would carry a name for the rest of their lives. A name spoken with a strange, fierce pride. The Chosin Few. This is their story. A world already at war. To understand how young Americans ended up freezing to death on a Korean mountainside, we have to go back 5 years earlier, to the summer of 1945, when a war ended and a new one was already being born. Japan surrenders. Its colonial empire collapses overnight, and nowhere does that collapse leave a more dangerous vacuum than on the Korean peninsula, a nation Japan had occupied for 35 years. With no time to plan, with no real understanding of Korea's history or its people, two exhausted superpowers reach for a map. The Soviet Union takes the surrender of Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel. The United States takes the south. It is meant to be temporary. It becomes permanent. By 1948, two rival governments claim to be the true Korea. In the north, a hardline communist regime under a young revolutionary named Kim Il-sung, backed by Stalin's Soviet Union. In the south, an anti-communist government under Syngman Rhee, propped up by Washington. The 38th parallel, once just a line on a map for logistical convenience, hardens into one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. For 2 years, the two Koreas glare at each other across barbed wire. Then, in the early hours of June 25, 1950, North Korean tanks roll south. It catches nearly everyone by surprise. South Korea's army, small and poorly equipped, collapses in days. Seoul falls within 72 hours. President Harry Truman, watching the dominoes of Soviet-backed expansion fall across Eastern Europe and now Asia, makes a decision that will define the rest of the century. The United States will intervene under the newly formed banner of the United Nations. It is the first true test of containment, the first hot war of the Cold War. General Douglas MacArthur, the aging, imperious hero of the Pacific Campaign, is given command. And by September of 1950, MacArthur pulls off one of the most audacious gambles in American military history, an amphibious landing at Incheon, deep behind North Korean lines, that shatters the invading army and sends it reeling back across the 38th parallel in disarray. It should have ended there. It almost did. But victory has a way of intoxicating men who have never tasted defeat. And Douglas MacArthur has not tasted defeat in a very long time. The road north. By early October 1950, the North Korean army is broken. Its soldiers are surrendering in the tens of thousands, fleeing north in ragged columns. In Washington, in Tokyo, in the newsrooms of America, a single question dominates. Do we stop at the 38th parallel, having restored the border? Or do we chase the enemy north and finish the job? MacArthur wants to finish the job. He wants to unify Korea under Syngman Rhee, to roll back communism entirely, and he believes, he insists, that neither the Soviet Union nor Communist China will intervene to stop him. Truman is uneasy. Intelligence officers are uneasy. But MacArthur's confidence and the intoxicating momentum of Incheon carries the day. United Nations forces cross the 38th parallel and drive north, toward the Yalu River, the border with Communist China itself. It is, in hindsight, one of the most consequential miscalculations of the entire Cold War. Because Mao Zedong has already made his decision. To Mao, a hostile American army on the Yalu at the doorstep of Manchuria is an existential threat that cannot be tolerated. In October 1950, Chinese forces begin secretly crossing the river, by night, on foot, hiding by day in villages and mountain forests to avoid American air reconnaissance. Entire armies, hundreds of thousands of men, disappear into the folds of North Korea's terrain undetected. There are warnings. Chinese diplomats, through neutral channels, explicitly tell the United States that China will not stand by if UN forces approach the Yalu. In late October, Chinese troops ambush advancing American and South Korean units near the town of Unsan, inflicting brutal losses before melting back into the mountains as suddenly as they appeared. It is a warning shot fired with the blood of American soldiers. MacArthur's intelligence chief, General Charles Willoughby, dismisses the evidence. The consensus in Tokyo remains: China will not intervene in force. The war, MacArthur assures Washington and the world, will be over by Christmas. He is wrong. Catastrophically wrong. And the men who will pay for that mistake are already marching north into the mountains, toward a lake called Chosin. The 1st Marine Division. Among the forces pushing north is one of the most storied fighting units in American history, the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver Prince Smith. Smith is not a man given to bravado. Quiet, deliberate, deeply skeptical of the optimism radiating out of MacArthur's headquarters, he does something almost unheard of in a military culture built on speed and aggression. He slows down. He insists on building an airstrip at the town of Hagaruri, at the base of the reservoir, over the objections of higher command who see it as a waste of time. He insists on stockpiling supplies along the route. He insists on keeping his division tighter, more consolidated, than the sprawling advance that X-Corps command wants. Smith cannot say exactly what he fears. He has no hard proof the Chinese are massing in these mountains in overwhelming numbers. But something is wrong. Korean civilians along the route speak in fragments of columns of soldiers moving at night. Patrols report contact with Chinese units, then silence. It doesn't add up to intervention on paper, but Smith's instincts, forged over decades of combat, tell him the mountains ahead are not empty. He will later say he felt he was sticking his neck out by moving as cautiously as he did. That caution will save thousands of American lives. By mid-November, the 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division, British Royal Marine Commandos and South Korean police units, is strung out along a single, narrow, unpaved mountain road running north from the port of Hungnam, through the town of Hagaruri, and up along the eastern and western edges of a man-made lake, the Chosin Reservoir, known to Koreans as Chongjin. It is one of the most forbidding pieces of terrain on Earth to fight a war in. Jagged, treeless mountains rise to 5,000 and 6,000 feet. The single supply road twists through narrow passes where a handful of defenders could, in theory, cut off an entire army. And winter, a Siberian winter sweeping down off the Manchurian plateau, is closing in fast. By the 3rd week of November, temperatures are already plunging to 0 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Weapons fail. Vehicles won't start. Blood plasma freezes solid in its bottles, useless to medics. Men's feet, sealed inside boots that trap sweat and moisture, begin to freeze from the inside, a condition that will claim more American casualties in the days ahead than enemy bullets. They call it, without irony, the frozen Chosin. And they haven't even seen the enemy yet. Ghosts in the mountains. The enemy sees them first. Unknown to General Smith, unknown to X-Corps Commander General Ned Amond, unknown to MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, the Chinese 9th Army Group, 3 full armies, roughly 120,000 men under General Song Sherluan, has been marching south through the mountains for weeks. They move only at night. By day they lie motionless under camouflage, sometimes for 18 hours at a stretch, so still that American reconnaissance planes flying directly overhead see nothing but empty, snow-covered hills. These are veteran soldiers, many of them survivors of China's brutal civil war and the fight against Japan. They are lightly equipped, devastatingly so, in ways that will cost them terribly in the days ahead. Many wear thin cotton uniforms wholly inadequate for the cold. Food is scarce. Some units survive on frozen potatoes and handfuls of rice. Ammunition is rationed with brutal precision. But they have numbers. Overwhelming numbers. And they have a plan as old as Sun Tzu. Let the enemy advance, let him stretch himself thin along an impossible road, and then close the trap from every direction at once. By November 27, 1950, that trap is set. Chinese divisions are positioned in the high ground on both sides of the reservoir, around the villages of Yudam-ni to the west, Hagaruri at the base, and along the single road east of the lake, where scattered army units of the 7th Infantry Division are strung out with almost no idea of what awaits them in the dark. At dusk that evening, the temperature drops to 14 degrees below zero. Marines and soldiers hunker into shallow foxholes scraped into frozen ground, too hard in places to dig at all. Many burn what little fuel they have simply trying to stay alive through the night, rather than for warmth, for comfort. They do not yet know that somewhere out in that darkness, more than 100,000 Chinese soldiers are moving into position around them. They are about to be surrounded by an army 7 times their size. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the mountains erupt with the sound of bugles, whistles, and gongs, a psychological weapon as much as a signal system, designed to disorient and terrify. Flares burst overhead. And then, out of the frozen darkness, come waves of Chinese infantry, screaming, charging directly into American machine gun and artillery fire. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir has begun. Yudam-ni. At the village of Yudam-ni, on the western side of the reservoir, 2 Marine regiments, the 5th and 7th Marines, roughly 8,000 men, find themselves suddenly fighting for their lives against elements of 3 separate Chinese divisions. The attacks come in relentless human waves, one after another through the night, as Chinese commanders throw men forward with a grim calculus. American firepower is devastating but finite, and enough bodies thrown at a position will eventually overwhelm it, or exhaust the ammunition of those defending it. Marine machine gunners fire until their barrels glow red in the darkness, until water-cooled guns freeze solid and have to be thawed with urine because there is nothing else warm enough. Riflemen empty magazine after magazine into the darkness, aiming at muzzle flashes and silhouettes against the snow. Artillery batteries fire point blank, shells arcing just over the heads of their own infantry to shred attacking waves at ranges of a few hundred yards. And still the Chinese keep coming. On the high ground above Yudam-ni, isolated companies find themselves completely cut off, surrounded on hilltops that become, in the words of survivors, islands in a sea of enemy soldiers. Communication with battalion headquarters is sporadic, radios failing in the extreme cold, batteries losing their charge within minutes of exposure. By the gray light of dawn on November 28th, the scale of the disaster becomes clear. This is not a raid, not a spoiling attack, not a limited Chinese intervention as MacArthur's headquarters had assured everyone. This is a massive, coordinated offensive by an army that officially, according to Washington and Tokyo, was not supposed to exist in these numbers. General Oliver Smith, receiving the reports at his headquarters, understands immediately what his men at Yudam-ni do not yet fully grasp. They are not merely under attack. They are surrounded. The road behind them, back through Hagaruri and down to the sea, is being cut piece by Chinese forces occupying the high ground along its entire length. 8,000 Marines at Yudam-ni are, in effect, an island now, cut off from resupply, cut off from reinforcement, with only the ammunition, food, and fuel they are carrying, and a shrinking window before the cold itself becomes as lethal an enemy as the Chinese army surrounding them. Fox Company and Toktong Pass. Between Yudam-ni and Hagaruri lies a narrow, vital stretch of road called Toktong Pass, the only route through which the trapped Marines at Yudam-ni can possibly break out to safety. Whoever holds this pass holds the fate of 8,000 men in their hands. Holding it is Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 240 men under a young captain named William Barber, ordered to dig in on a barren, wind-swept hilltop overlooking the pass and hold it at all costs while the rest of the division fights for its life elsewhere. On the night of November 27th, the same night the offensive begins at Yudam-ni, Fox Company is hit by an entire Chinese regiment, thousands of men against 240 Marines. In the opening minutes of the attack, roughly a third of the company becomes casualties. Captain Barber himself is shot through the hip early in the fighting and continues to command from a stretcher, refusing evacuation, propped up so he can see the battlefield and direct his men through the long, brutal night. What follows is one of the most celebrated defensive stands in Marine Corps history. 4 or 5 days and 6 nights, surrounded, outnumbered by more than 10 to 1 at times, cut off from resupply except for airdrops that scatter as often as they land true, Fox Company holds Toktong Pass. They fight off attack after attack in temperatures plunging to 30 below zero, their wounded stacked in a makeshift aid station because there is nowhere to evacuate them to, their casualties mounting with every assault, refusing to yield the high ground that is the only lifeline for the entire trapped division. By the time they are finally relieved, Fox Company has suffered roughly 80% casualties, killed, wounded, or frostbitten. Of the 240 Marines who dug in on that hill, fewer than 80 are still able to walk when relief finally arrives. But the pass holds. And because it holds, the road out of Yudam-ni remains open. Barely, desperately, but open. Captain William Barber will be awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership in the defense of Fox Hill. His men, forever after, will simply call themselves Fox Company. It will not need further explanation among Marines. Everyone will know. Hagaruri, the lifeline at the base of the reservoir, sits the small town of Hagaruri, the single most important piece of ground in the entire campaign. It is here that General Oliver Prince Smith's insistence, weeks earlier, on building an airstrip against the objections of higher command, will save the lives of thousands of men. Hagaruri itself is under siege almost from the first night. Its garrison, a patchwork of Marine service troops, Army stragglers, and a hastily assembled composite unit that includes cooks, clerks, and engineers pressed into infantry roles, is a fraction of what would normally be needed to hold a perimeter against a determined Chinese assault. On the night of November 28th, Chinese forces attack Hagaruri's East Hill, a critical piece of high ground overlooking the town, and very nearly break through. The line holds, but only barely, through a night of desperate close-quarters fighting in the freezing dark, often decided by grenades and bayonets rather than rifles, whose actions freeze solid in the extreme cold. And through all of it, engineers and Seabees work around the clock, in brutal sub-zero temperatures, using bulldozers and hand tools to finish carving a rough airstrip out of the frozen ground. It is nowhere near finished to peacetime standards. It is barely a strip of packed earth and gravel. But on December 1st, the first C-47 transport plane lands at Hagaruri, and what follows will become one of the most significant aerial operations in military history. Over the days that follow, thousands of wounded and frostbitten men are flown out of Hagaruri to hospitals in the rear, saving countless lives that would otherwise have been lost to gangrene, exposure, and blood loss in the brutal cold. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies are flown in on the return trips. That single airstrip, built against the advice of higher headquarters, becomes the thin, fragile lifeline that keeps the entire 1st Marine Division alive. General Smith's quiet stubbornness, his refusal to move fast and light the way MacArthur's headquarters wanted, will be remembered as one of the single most important command decisions of the entire war. East of Chosin, Task Force Faith. While the Marines fight for Yudam-ni and Toktong Pass and Hagaruri, a smaller, less remembered tragedy is unfolding on the eastern side of the reservoir, one that history has never given quite the same attention, but whose suffering was every bit as terrible. Here, along the frozen eastern shore, is a mixed force of roughly 3,000 men from the U.S. Army 7th Infantry Division, infantry battalions, an artillery battalion, and various support elements, strung out along the same exposed, narrow road, with even less preparation for what is coming than the Marines to the west. When the Chinese offensive erupts on the night of November 27th, these army units are hit just as hard, just as suddenly, by the same overwhelming numbers. Over the following days, their commander, Colonel Alan McLean, is killed attempting to reach one of his forward units under fire. Command falls to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, and the scattered force becomes known to history as Task Force Faith. Cut off, low on ammunition, hauling wounded who cannot walk in a column with dwindling fuel and no air cover in the opening days due to weather, Task Force Faith attempts a desperate breakout south along the frozen road toward Hagaruri. Cut off, low on ammunition, hauling wounded who cannot walk in a column with dwindling fuel and no air cover in the opening days due to weather, Task Force Faith attempts a desperate breakout south along the frozen road toward Hagaruri. It becomes a running gauntlet of ambush after ambush, the column raked by fire from the high ground on both sides, vehicles destroyed and abandoned, wounded men loaded onto truck beds that themselves become targets. Lieutenant Colonel Faith is killed leading the breakout, struck by grenade fragments while trying to rally his men forward through Chinese roadblocks. He will be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Of the roughly 3,000 men who made up Task Force Faith, only about 1,000 reached safety at Hagaruri, many of them wounded, frostbitten, shattered. It is, proportionally, one of the costliest episodes of the entire campaign, a story of raw courage and catastrophic loss that unfolded largely out of sight of the war correspondents and photographers who would later immortalize the Marines' fight on the western side of the lake. History has often remembered Chosin as a Marine Corps story. It was never only that. Soldiers of the United States Army died in those same mountains, in the same cold, fighting the same impossible odds, and their sacrifice deserves to be remembered with equal weight. The breakout from Yudam. By December 1st, General Oliver Smith makes the decision that will define the entire campaign, and that will later cement his reputation as one of the most respected commanders in Marine Corps history. Ordered by higher command to retreat, Smith famously tells war correspondents a phrase that will echo through military history for generations. Retreat, hell. We're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction. It is not bravado. It is precision. Smith understands that his division is not broken, not routed, not fleeing in panic. It is a disciplined fighting force, still carrying its wounded, still carrying its equipment, still willing and able to fight its way out through a gauntlet of Chinese divisions, and that is exactly what it intends to do. The plan is as audacious as it is dangerous. The 8,000 Marines trapped at Yudam-ni will fight their way south, down the same mountain road, through Chinese-held terrain, all the way to Hagaruri, roughly 14 miles away through some of the most brutal terrain and coldest conditions any American force had ever fought in. They bring everything. Every wounded man. Every piece of serviceable equipment they can move. Even their dead, wrapped and lashed to vehicles, because no Marine will be left behind on that mountain, alive or dead, if it can possibly be helped. The march begins on December 1st. Marine infantry fights for each successive ridge and hilltop overlooking the road, clawing the high ground away from Chinese positions foxhole by foxhole, while the column of vehicles, wounded, and supplies crawls forward below. Air support, when weather allows, when planes can fly in the brutal cold and low visibility, becomes a lifeline, Corsair fighters diving in danger close to hammer Chinese positions just yards from friendly lines. It takes nearly 4 days of continuous, grinding combat to cover those 14 miles. Temperatures plunge as low as 35 degrees below zero at night. Marines who fall wounded and cannot be immediately treated risk freezing to death within minutes if bleeding slows blood flow to extremities. Frostbite claims fingers, toes, entire feet among men who simply cannot get dry, cannot get warm for days at a stretch. And still they fight. Ridge by ridge, roadblock by roadblock, the column pushes south, until on December 3rd, the exhausted, frostbitten survivors of Yudam-ni finally stumble into the perimeter at Hagaruri, where the garrison that has held that critical junction for days is waiting to receive them. It is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary feats of sustained combat endurance in American military history. The March to the Sea. Reunited at Hagaruri, the 1st Marine Division, along with the survivors of Task Force Faith and other Army units, roughly 14,000 men in total, now faces the next and in some ways most dangerous phase of the entire campaign. The march south from Hagaruri to the coast, roughly 43 miles through mountain terrain still crawling with Chinese forces determined to destroy them before they can reach the sea. Ahead of them lies Funchilin Pass, and within it, a single, irreplaceable bottleneck that Chinese forces understand as well as the Marines do. A concrete bridge spanning a deep gorge near the Sudong power plant, the only crossing point for miles in either direction. If that bridge is destroyed and cannot be repaired, the entire column, its vehicles, its wounded, its heavy equipment, will be trapped on the wrong side of the gorge with nowhere to go. Chinese forces destroy the bridge, not once but twice, determined to seal that pass and doom the retreating column. Each time U.S. Army and Marine engineers respond with extraordinary ingenuity under fire. The solution in the end comes from the sky. The U.S. Air Force airdrops prefabricated steel bridge sections, treadway bridge spans each weighing thousands of pounds, by parachute, directly to the engineers waiting below. Some of the massive sections drift off target and are lost in the mountains. But enough land close enough, intact enough, that Army engineers, working in brutal cold under intermittent enemy fire, are able to assemble a working bridge across the gorge in a matter of hours. It is one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the entire Korean War, and without it, the story of Chosin might have ended in the complete destruction of an entire American division rather than its escape. Behind and alongside the engineers, the fighting never stops. Marine and Army infantry continue to claw the high ground away from Chinese positions overlooking the road at every turn, while air power, when the weather clears enough to allow it, hammers Chinese formations attempting to mass for a final effort to cut the column off before it reaches the sea. By December 11th, the lead elements of the 1st Marine Division reach the port city of Hungnam, on the North Korean coast, where the U.S. Navy is waiting. They have fought their way out. 14,000 men, having marched and fought through 70 miles of enemy-held mountains, in temperatures that at times fell below -35 degrees, surrounded for most of that distance by an enemy force that outnumbered them many times over, they have broken out, and they have brought their wounded and in large part their dead with them. The Hungnam evacuation. What follows at Hungnam is one of the largest and most successful military evacuations by sea in American history, a desperate, extraordinary effort to save not only the surviving soldiers and Marines of the Chosin campaign, but tens of thousands of North Korean civilians who have fled south alongside the retreating UN forces, terrified of what life under a returning communist regime, and the reprisals that would surely follow their association with American troops, would bring. Over roughly 2 weeks in December 1950, the U.S. Navy, working around the clock, loads more than 100,000 United Nations military personnel, along with their equipment and vehicles, onto transport ships in Hungnam Harbor. Naval gunfire from cruisers and destroyers offshore holds back Chinese forces attempting to close in on the shrinking perimeter, providing a protective shield of steel and fire around the evacuation. Alongside the troops, in one of the most remarkable humanitarian episodes of the entire war, nearly 100,000 North Korean refugees are evacuated by sea as well, most famously aboard a single merchant vessel, the SS Meredith Victory, a cargo ship designed to carry a few dozen crew that ultimately carries more than 14,000 refugees on its harrowing voyage south, becoming, to this day, recognized as the largest rescue by a single ship in maritime history. Remarkably, 5 babies are born aboard the ship during that voyage, and not a single life is lost among the refugees crammed into her holds. On Christmas Eve 1950, the last American ships pull away from Hungnam Harbor. Behind them, demolition teams detonate the port facilities and remaining supplies, denying them to the advancing Chinese and North Korean forces. It is the final symbolic end of the UN advance to the Yalu River, a retreat in the strictest military sense, but one carried out with such discipline, such coordination, and such extraordinary courage that it stands, even in defeat, as one of the most remarkable achievements of American arms in the 20th century. The cost. The numbers even now are difficult to comprehend. Of the roughly 30,000 United Nations troops engaged in the Chosin Reservoir campaign, American casualties alone are estimated at close to 18,000, killed, wounded, missing, and, in staggering numbers, injured by frostbite and exposure to cold so extreme it functioned as a weapon every bit as lethal as enemy fire. Some units suffered frostbite casualties equal to or exceeding their combat casualties. Men who survived direct enemy assaults lost fingers, toes, entire limbs to cold in the days and weeks that followed. Chinese casualties are estimated to have been even more catastrophic. Historians estimate as many as 48,000 or more Chinese soldiers killed, wounded, or lost to the same brutal cold that devastated American ranks, in some cases entire units freezing to death in their positions, found afterwards still holding their weapons, having died not from combat but from a Manchurian winter they were desperately, tragically unprepared for. The Chinese 9th Army Group, the force that had encircled and very nearly annihilated the entire 1st Marine Division, was itself so devastated by the fighting and the cold that it required months to be reconstituted as an effective fighting force. A hidden strategic cost of the campaign that is often overlooked in accounts that focus solely on the American ordeal. 17 Medals of Honor would ultimately be awarded for actions during the Chosin Reservoir campaign, an extraordinary concentration of valor recognized in a single brutal battle, a testament to the sheer scale of individual courage demanded of the men who fought there. The Chosin Few. In the years that followed, the men who fought and survived the Battle of Chosin Reservoir would adopt a name for themselves, worn with a quiet, hard-earned pride. The Chosin Few. It is a title that speaks to more than survival. It speaks to an experience so singular, so extreme, that those who lived through it would forever understand each other in a way few others ever could. Veterans of Chosin would go on to describe the psychological weight of that campaign, not simply the fear of enemy fire, but the relentless, grinding terror of a cold that attacked every single man equally, indiscriminately, regardless of rank or unit or branch of service. For decades, the Korean War itself would carry an unfortunate nickname in American memory, the Forgotten War, squeezed in popular consciousness between the vast, world-spanning drama of the Second World War and the deeply divisive, culturally seismic experience of Vietnam. Chosin, in many ways, became the most forgotten battle of a largely forgotten war, despite standing, by any honest measure, among the most extraordinary feats of combat endurance in American military history. That has slowly begun to change. Veterans organizations, historians, documentary filmmakers, and the families of those who fought and died in those frozen mountains have worked for decades to ensure the story is not lost. Monuments have been built. Oral histories have been recorded and preserved. The Medal of Honor recipients of Chosin, men like William Barber, Don Faith, and others, are remembered by name in official Marine Corps and Army histories, their citations studied by new generations of officers as case studies in leadership under conditions almost beyond human endurance. And still, the numbers of the Chosin Few dwindle each year, as the last of that generation, now in their 90s, passes on. What remains is the story, a story of ordinary young Americans, many barely out of high school, thrown into one of the most catastrophic strategic surprises in the history of American warfare, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them by staggering margins, betrayed by weather conditions that would have broken lesser units entirely, and who, instead of collapsing, fought their way out, together.